I watched a TikTok. I'm not a member of TikTok, but it showed up in the shorts when I was looking through various YouTube things. And the question was posed, is it easier to crochet or knit? So the girl presented the question like, is it easier to knit or crochet? And there was a pause, and you're waiting for the answer. As a viewer, you're waiting. What's she going to say? And then she goes, what the I don't know. She used the F word. And it's funny because I watched that video and a few days later it went back to it because I wanted to use it for my video here. And she has edited it. Somebody must have said, look, take it out. I don't know if it was family member, friend, who, what. But anyway, so I'm going to answer the question. Is it easier to knit or crochet? What's the difference? And I'm going to tell you the difference. If memory serves me well, and it usually does, it was my little sister who taught me how to crochet. She was about 8 and I was about 12. So then years later, a friend taught me how to crochet, working with very fine thread and making doilies. When I moved to Newfoundland for work, I think it was 1970 somewhere, I met with a large number of knitters, and that's where I learned how to knit because that's what they were all doing. So crocheting was almost looked down upon. If you crocheted, you crochet. But if you knew how to knit, it was like, ooh, you're a master. It's the elite of the world. I don't know if you experienced that, but I did. I grew up during the 60s. My daughter used to introduce me, hi, this is my mother, the hippie. Or she used to be a hippie. I don't know. So those things are still ingrained. But it was during that time when, during the 60s, that crocheting was actually beginning to surge. It was becoming quite popular. So that's probably one reason why I learned how to crochet as opposed to knitting to start. Historically, it's been thought that knitting is older than crocheting. So crocheting made its appearance, as far as we know with research, during the 19th century. The first documented pattern that was written for crocheting emerged in Europe in the 1800s. So if you go no further in this video, the answer to the difference between knitting and crocheting is looks. How does it look? Because crochet stitches and knitting stitches look different. There's a difference in the feel, there's a difference in the style, the patterns that you get to use. So basically, it's about looks and then personal choice. So if you're trying to decide between the two, as a new crafter, try crocheting. It's less expensive and it's a little faster. So if you crochet a washcloth, you start small. You're more likely to finish a project and gain a sense of satisfaction with that. And you're gradually gaining a skill and a technique. So then after that, try knitting one. And then you can discover on your own what the difference is. And for you, know which one is better, which one you want to do. Or, maybe you're just going to take them both. That's what I do. There are 6 things that we're going to look at in terms of differences. One is tools, stitches, fabric texture, the speed, how long it takes you to do something, and how easy you can actually get through the project, like, the knitting stitch as opposed to the crochet stitch. The patterns, there's a lot of difference in patterns, and the applications, how you get to use it. First of all, the tools. You use long needles for knitting, and you can use pointed, double-sided pointed needles, short needles. There's no matter how you look at it when knitting, you need to have needles. And I've heard that buying a hook is cheaper than buying needles. So with the hook or with crochet, you have one hook. So the advantages are that it's easier to work on a project when you're on an airplane, for example, which is what I do, flying somewhere. In fact, it's easier to travel almost anywhere, even if you're just going for a picnic in the park. if you tend to knit then. Any place you go, you have got one hook, one ball of wool, and your project, which is usually in your head, or else you're following along on a piece of paper. Knitting and crocheting both operate on the basis of a series of loops. So you're inserting your needle or your hook into a previous hook or loop, and then you're pulling your yarn through to create a new hook or loop. So some people find it easier to crochet instead of learning all the stitches for knitting beyond knit and purl. So common stitches for knitting are the knit and purl, and common stitches for crocheting are single crochet, double crochet, and a slip stitch. And you can use slip stitch for both knitting and crocheting. Personally, I find it a little bit difficult sometimes to get my brain switched over to crocheting stitches when they start talking about half double crochets and treble stitches and chain one in between these treble and triple and double and I don't know. Bottom line is you have to learn all the stitches, and it is a learning curve. It's like learning a new language. So you have to decide which language you would like to learn first. Now, knitting usually creates a softer, stretchier fabric that's often a lot smoother. I'm knitting this, don't ask what it is, some kind of neck cooling cloth, maybe a warmer because the winter might come up. Well, it will come up, no doubt. But it's soft. And even if and this is what you call stockinette stitch, knit on one side and purl on the other. And if I use a garter stitch with this particular cotton fabric, a garter stitch tends to be a little bit more coarse. But essentially your stitches are closer together than crochet, and unless you do something like this, unless you're doing a basket with 5 strands, then your crochet stitches are close together. But in terms of making a garment, crocheting tends to be a little bit more coarse, thicker, and your stitches are further apart, whereas knitting, the stitches are closer together. So again, preference, right? Preference. So it can be said that crocheting is faster and knitting is slower. So when I knit, I'm watching TV a lot of times, or talking to my husband, engaged in conversation. And so that means that I can actually knit usually, maybe not so much on a purl row, but I can watch TV and have my eyes somewhere else and still knit, because for me, this is something you grow into. You get used to the feel of the knitting. So for knitting, I can look away, I can watch TV. Whereas when I'm crocheting, I'll just give you an example of that. Grab my hook, if I can find it. Now I can find my hook. But when I'm crocheting, I'm actually going into the loop and then going into the loop on the fabric. And it means that I have to pay attention. Let me get my hook and show you. Here's the hook. That's a number 5 with 5 strands of wool. I got to get them all in here in the right order. So then I'm going into the next hole in the project. I'm getting, in this case, gathering all those 5 yarns, pulling it up over and pull it through, and I have to pay attention. So whereas knitting I can do without looking. Now, some of this I can as I'm pulling the yarns through, like sometimes I can look away. But what if I miss a strand? Well, I'll tell you what happens if you miss a strand. You get a loop hanging out there, so then I have to take the work back and do it over. And again, this might be personal opinion, but I just find it easier knitting. If I'm watching TV, talking to somebody, doing something social, and knitting is a lot easier, especially if it's a straight knit and purl. Whereas if I'm crocheting, I got to pay attention more. So I can listen to, let's say, an audiobook or podcast, or sometimes just listening to somebody talk about knitting on a YouTube. I don't really have to watch them, then I can do crochet. So if I have to pay attention, it's crochet. If I want to relax and just work on a project, it's knitting. And here's something that people have talked to me about, and that is that it's hard to find good crochet patterns. I knew a lady, she was looking for a crochet tank top. And you can, if you Google it, you can find all kinds of knitting tank top patterns. You can find the patterns on Etsy, on Pinterest, any of those places that you look for patterns, even free ones. But to find crochet ones is a little bit harder. So knitting usually offers more patterns than crocheting because it's an older skill. It's an older technique, whatever, to engage in. Whereas crocheting, as I mentioned, or did I mention it? Traditionally, crocheting came about the early 19th century. So traditionally, knitting has been used for garments like clothing, socks, hats, scarves, mittens, even shawls, and I like those. Now, crochet has been used traditionally for home decoration items like toys and accessories, hats and bags. So it does seem to be a little bit more limited in terms of its use, and I think that's because of the structure and the style. So currently, crocheting seems to be enjoying more of a buzz. It's showing up more in YouTube feeds, and I did some research on it, and apparently, yes, it is gaining momentum once again. Hey, we're going back to the 60s. That should be a good thing. Here's a little tidbit of information since my husband is Irish. During the 1840s, there was this great Irish famine on the go. I think it was called the potato famine. And what women would do, these Irish ladies, they would crochet lace and sell it. Now that's because lace in the 1840s was extremely popular. So the Irish ladies crocheted lace and they used it for dresses and shawls and baby bonnets and that sort of thing. And people actually purchased up this lace in order to sew it onto their garments. So it was very popular at the time. It was in demand, so it was definitely a trend. So if you're thinking of something to make that will sell, let's say in a market, you want to consider what's in demand, what's popular, what's trending. And so the question for even making anything, even these videos, is like, what's going? What are people interested? What's happening? So I say this is for my knitting friends. Maybe it should be for my crochet friends if I'm going to follow a trend.